All right, so in our last video, we talked about the 3 types of expansion diffusion, which were contagious, hierarchical, and stimulus. And we talked about the idea that expansion diffusion was basically cultural diffusion or cultural spreading that took place within a geographic area. So this one is the other category of cultural diffusion, and it's called relocation diffusion. So it is the spread of an idea or an element of culture through physical movement of people. Basically, to me, it's the introduction of culture to a new geographic area. So it's the spreading kind of to a different geographic area. So you can see that in a little diagram at the bottom left-hand corner. We have the red dots skipping over the blue dots and spreading their culture to the new red dots. So yesterday we looked at, let me see this map of Islam here. We saw Islam spread within a geographic area, and that was an example of what we called expansion diffusion, kind of all the different types of expansion diffusion probably. So the different, kind of a different map here is what I would call relocation diffusion. So you have the spread of Islam at a different time period, kind of centuries after the most of the places in the world that have adopted Islam as their primary religion did so, spreading to Indonesia and spreading through relocation, spreading through trade, spreading through the physical movement of people to a new place, right? So that is what I think of when I think of relocation diffusion, is the spread of religion or language for the most part, but also other things too. But religion and language are probably the most predominant. In this map, you can see the spread of English and kind of all the different places in the world where English spread to. So relocation diffusion is highly, I would say, associated with a couple different things. Trade is probably the first one. So as economic goods kind of are traded back and forth, new people obviously have interactions with each other, and we have the spread of culture. So, and sort of related to that, I would also add in colonialism and imperialism. So as kind of throughout the last 500 or 600 years, as mostly European powers have colonized different parts of the world, they have brought with them many of their cultural traits. So we can see on the bottom left-hand side, kind of a lot of food-related introduction back and forth. This is called the Columbian Exchange. We'll talk about it in the agricultural unit. But so what's interesting about that, I think, is a lot of the types of food that we associated with place are not actually indigenous to that place, not actually from that place. They're brought over from a new place, so that we can see interesting ways in which that has affected culture. And the map on the right-hand side, I think, is a map of Spanish colonialism. So notice the places in the red are still places that we would associate with having pretty high levels of Spanish-speaking populations, people that practice Roman Catholicism. So in many ways, those are cultural traits that were introduced by the Spanish in their colonization of that part of the world. All right, and we got an English-looking octopus man here. So kind of defining these terms, we'll talk a lot about these terms later. It's not super important that you be able to define these now. I just want to put in your head the idea of relocation diffusion kind of being associated with a lot of these things. So imperialism, the policy of extending a country's power and influence through diplomacy or military force, oftentimes with kind of like a hierarchical relationship where you have kind of a dominant country subjugating or colonizing a less developed place. And then the other term that's pretty closely related is colonialism. So the policy of a country seeking to extend or retain its authority over the people or territories, generally with the aim of economic dominance. So as we have seen, or as we saw a lot of the extraction of natural resources from different parts of the world by many countries from Europe, we also saw diffusion of culture, oftentimes language, religion, and a lot of other elements of culture that we would associate with European groups. And it's not just Europe. There's a lot of other examples too, but those are probably the ones that are in your head, or probably in the most common to talk about. All right, so last thing we are going to talk about is how culture changes as a result of cultural diffusion. So these are 3 terms that you have read about in your book, but I want to talk about specifically called assimilation, acculturation, and syncretism. So I think you already have this down in your notes too, so no need to write all of it down. I would focus on trying to understand what this table means. So basically, what happens when we have two groups coming into contact with each other with different cultures, and what are the terms for what might happen? Assimilation is when we have the adoption of a given minority group into a majority culture. So basically, a smaller group of people absorbs the majority's culture and at some point leaves behind elements of their culture. So we see this a lot in the world with the adoption of big sort of universalizing languages and religions, and the leaving behind of folk religions, or endangered languages. We'll talk about that a lot later in the year. The second one is acculturation. So this is kind of in between, where people experience cultural changes as a result of the meeting. So essentially, you have the retention of some aspects of minority culture, and the adoption of new aspects of culture. And the last one, the one that we're going to watch a video of, is called syncretism. So the blending of beliefs and practices as a result of contact between different cultures. So essentially, a lot of times, so you have something, you kind of have two cultures meeting, and they create some element of new culture, right? So a really good example of this that I like, and you're about to watch a video of, is language and what are called pidgin languages. So pidgin languages come from when you have basically a dominant language coming into contact with a smaller language. Oftentimes, in order for both groups to be able to understand each other, they will create a new language called a pidgin language, which is in effect a syncretic form of culture that is blended together, fused together. And oftentimes, you see a lot of pidgin languages kind of in as a result of colonialism, and as a result of these relationships between new uh, dominant groups or languages being introduced to sort of non-indigenous areas, and fusing together to create some way that they can understand each other. Okay, so you're about to watch an example of that, or kind of a description of that. So I'll sign off.